Idaho Republican Congressman George Hansen was sentenced to jail today and fined $40,000 for filing false financial disclosure forms. Hansen says he will appeal. Tonight, we'll have the latest on the story, complete with the partisan political analysis.
Good evening. The news for George Hansen was all bad today. First, in Washington this morning, the House Ethics Committee adopted a report concluding that Hansen has violated both federal law and the House's own rules. The committee will hold hearings beginning next Wednesday to determine what punishment to recommend to the full House. Punishments could range from a reprimand to expulsion. Then later this morning, U.S. District Judge Joyce Hens Green sentenced the 53-year-old Republican congressman to between 5 and 15 months in prison and fined him $40,000. Judge Green said she based her decision on what she called, quote, deterrence, setting an example, punishment, rehabilitation, and justice, end quote. The fine was the maximum allowed. The jail sentence could have been as much as 5 years on each of the 4 felony convictions. Hansen stood before the judge this morning and defended his actions, saying, quote, something must be wrong with the system, end quote. He predicted he will win an appeal that could go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Hansen, who won the Republican nomination in Idaho's 2nd District just last month in a close race with Dan Adamson, also said today, and I quote, some of the evidence was twisted and perhaps even manufactured, end quote. That in reference to the Ethics Committee's action today. Hansen has scheduled news conferences in Idaho Falls and Boise tomorrow, presumably to talk more about the sentencing and the Ethics Committee's actions. We'll be talking in a moment with the state Democratic Party chairman, with an Eastern Idaho Republican who still very much supports George Hansen, and with 2 journalists. Meanwhile, other Idaho Republicans weren't saying much of anything today. One party leader, Lee Shellman of Coeur d'Alene, was quoted by his United Press International as saying that Hansen might be willing to pull out of the race now if he thinks his defeat is likely in November. But there was no hint at all of that from the congressman today. And the man scheduled to face Hansen in November says he doesn't believe the congressman will quit. I talked earlier this afternoon with Democrat Richard Stallings.
No, I really don't. This is obviously the next step in the legal procedure. If he was going to resign, it seems to me he would have done it prior to the primary. But he had been convicted at that point. The sentencing is the next step, and so I don't see any change.
Do you find anything surprising by today's news?
Not really. She was rather lenient on the jail sentence. He could have gotten 20 years, I guess. But in fact, she gave him 5 to 15 months. I assume that it'll be closer to 5 if he serves any time at all. The monetary fine did surprise me a little bit.
The size of it? The
size of it, yes.
Does this now make things easier for you in some way, that this part of this process has passed?
I don't think so. I felt that from the day we announced that I had a pretty good shot based on last times and based upon the way we were gaining support. And we built a campaign around issues and around some ideas that we had rather than what might happen to Hansen. I am not very excited about winning on an anti-George platform, and so we're going to continue our same program. His supporters are going to be there regardless of what he does. We have to work on that swing group, the moderate Republican Democrat group in the middle, and our program will go as directed. It'll make it a little harder for him in the sense of fundraising. It'll make it a little harder for him in the sense of generating workers, but as far as total votes, he'll still have a sizable number.
Does it, as each one of these steps in this process unfolds and it becomes a little more difficult for him, do you sense that people are, that even some of his hardcore supporters are falling off and saying, well, this is the step, and this is as far as I go with George Hansen?
Yes, we're seeing that. There is a definite erosion. But I think that began last year. It began with the indictments. This is just sort of the final touch for some, but you still have a bedrock of 30–35% that believe when he says that they're just out to get him. Believe that the Reagan administration, for some reason, is trying to put George away for some reason, and it's sort of the conspiracy theory, and it's still believed by quite a few people.
Despite your professed desire to talk about the issues, and probably my desire to talk about the issues at least sometime during this campaign, this will be the issue, won't it?
It really will be. In many ways, this is central in most people's mind. But my concern is that everyone's decided about this. Now, if I continue to hammer it and make that the central issue, I'm not going to change anybody. The true believers are going to stay with him regardless. Those that are against him are going to be against him. The moderates have already made their decisions. There's no gain except I make a lot of people mad, and then I have the next day to figure out how to represent those angry people. I would much rather win on the basis of my own merits than on his problems.
So are you saying that there won't be many people between now and November who will change their minds about who to vote for in this race?
If I run a shabby, low-level campaign, there will be some changes, and they will be away from me. And I'd rather not have that happen.
How long do you think this is going to go on? Will the appeal process now, we won't know before the election, will we?
Oh, no, the appeal could last a year or so before it's completed. And of course his argument is that the appeal will redeem him and he'll be all right. The other side of it will be what the House Ethics Committee does. They've also begun taking action. My feeling is they'll be rather lenient. Their tradition has been that of protecting their own. When Studs and Crane were had problems with the House aides, the Ethics Committee was very, very lenient in dealing with them. And so I suspect the committee will meet and make some noise, but I don't expect a lot of action from them.
What do you think would be an appropriate penalty for the House to impose on Congressman Hansen?
Well, that's very difficult for me because obviously I have a bias in this, but I would think a censure would not be too stiff for him.
The chairman of your party, Mel Morgan, said today that Republicans now have a noose around their neck. The Republican Party in general has a noose around its neck, and the name of that noose is George Hansen. Is this going to hurt, and not only as it affects your race, but will it hurt Republicans across the board?
Oh, I think so. I think so. In the eastern part of the state, there were half a dozen Republicans, legislators and state senators, that put their name on a political ad to support George Hansen in the primary. And I think a lot of people have placed a lot of their own reputation with Mr. Hansen. And I think those candidates that choose to make Mr. Hansen the issue in state legislative races, in other kinds of races, will get some mileage out of this.
Let me ask you finally about something that you were talking about here earlier this week. You said earlier this week, and I'll paraphrase a little bit, that someone basically is spreading rumors about you and your job at Ricks College and your private life. Any more that you know tonight about where those rumors are coming from or who's spreading them?
No, that was really kind of a passing remark that I had made, and I was interested in the attention that it got. That's part of every campaign. Some people get very desperate, and of course the solution then is to do rumors. We did not accuse Mr. Hansen or his camp of doing it. I don't know where they're coming from, but I know they're part of it, and my point in mentioning it at the time was I'd like to get this out right now before we get to August or September or October, when it could really be damaging, and make sure the record is straight. I don't know where they're coming from. If I found out where they were coming from, then of course we would take some legal action, because you know, I can take political differences, that's fine, but when they start slandering me or impugning my name, then they become vulnerable to legal action, and we will do that.
Have you headed off possible damage in that regard?
Well, I would hope so. I would hope so. I think by making your intentions known and say we're not going to ignore these things, that we will address them, then I think that people that have that kind of inclination will give it some real deep consideration.
Mr. Stallings, we appreciate your being here. Thank you, sir.
Pleased to be here.
Idaho Democrats from all over the state were just arriving in Boise today when the news of Hansen's sentencing came. The Democrats are holding their state convention in Boise this weekend. Our first bit of political analysis tonight comes from the Democratic Party chairman in Idaho, Mel Morgan of Pocatello. Mr. Morgan, I saw you quoted today as implying that this might be the end for George Hansen. Is that how you feel?
Yes, I feel that way politically. Let me say that I take no solace in what's happened to George. I feel for his family at this time. It's a mess, and the mess is there and it won't go away. But in my opinion, the Republicans have got something to overcome now at this point. They've all been on the bandwagon, and their candidate is badly tainted.
What do they have to overcome?
Well, I think you have to overcome the people that have endorsed George. Let's forget about the personalities of George Hansen or Mel Morgan and let's say that this is another campaign. You have a convicted felon that's running for office, and I can't see how that would help anybody or help any party.
But you heard Richard Stallings just say that he didn't think it would make it any easier for him, what's happened today.
You make it easier for Richard?
Yes, sir.
Well, you know, it's a difference of opinion. I personally thought that Richard Stallings would win this fall regardless of what has happened in the George Hansen matter. So I take a little different view than he has. But you can't continue to erode the base of your support, as George has done, in my opinion, over the years, and win a race. You can look at the hardcore percentage figures of the George Hansen loyalists, and that's not enough to win an election.
Do you have any real hard evidence that that support is eroding, or is that just sort of a gut feeling?
Well, I'm not saying that the support is eroding. I'm saying that that the hardcore, 30% roughly, of the George Hansen people are not going anywhere. They're going to stay with George.
But you just said his support was eroding.
That, before this, was roughly at 35%.
I see, okay.
And I think that's come down. A poll will show that, in my opinion.
Okay. What about the effect on other Republicans? Again, your quote about the noose around the party's neck. How will it affect other Republicans other than George Hansen?
Well, I think it will affect some of the people running in southeastern Idaho that have come out strongly for George. I know that...
You mean people running for the legislature?
Yes, people that are running for the legislature, that this isn't now we've got a different ballgame. You have somebody that has been convicted and sentenced, running for office. And that changed from what happened at the primary level. That changes things a little.
So this is just ratcheted up another
that's
notch.
All. Just tightens up the noose a little more.
I see.
And you know, when you analyze what the Republican state chairman has done, I can tell you that if that was done by a Democrat in the Democratic Party, and that's coming out in favor of one candidate overwhelmingly in a primary race, I would have been ridden out of office.
So no doubt in your mind that politically speaking, George Hansen is done.
I never say George Hansen is done. George is a remarkable politician, but
this is a step nearer the end.
This is a step nearer to the end.
Okay, we'll come back, sir. Thank you. A view of today's events now from one of George Hansen's longtime and still one of his most ardent supporters. Rusty Barlow is a former Republican member of the Idaho legislature. He is again a candidate for the legislature this year, running for a Senate seat in southeastern Idaho. Mr. Barlow is with us tonight in Pocatello. You still support George Hansen despite what's happened today, Mr. Barlow?
Well, of course. This was expected all along. I think you could call this trial by ambush. I'd like to address a few points, if I may, that were made. I just talked to the congressman when I found out I was going to be on this program, and I'd like to assure everyone there is no pullout. There won't be a pullout. And I think that there's going to be some surprise Democrats in November, because I think when George takes his story to the voters, like he did in the primary, and of course he'll do it with increased efforts in the general election, people are going to see what's been happening to him, and I think he'll beat Stallings by a larger margin than he did last time he ran.
Let me ask you about a couple of these things I mentioned earlier on, about at least a couple Republicans today apparently saying that there ought to be a powwow perhaps of party leaders, and they ought to evaluate whether the congressman ought to step aside.
Well, I'd say if he'd done anything wrong, he ought to step aside. But what we're talking about is a little paper shuffling, can't even call it a mistake. No, I don't think he should step aside. He hasn't done anything wrong. I think if that trial were to be held out here in Idaho, there wouldn't have been the problems that there were when it was held back east. I think the verdict would have been much different, and I think there's no question he'll win the appeal.
You heard Mr. Morgan just say that he thought some of the support was eroding.
Well, I think during the primary election, there were some of the people that had been Hansen supporters moved over into the, what was this fellow that ran against him?
Dan Adamson.
Dan Adamson's campaign. I see a lot of those people coming back. There's meetings being held around the state in support of George now by some of these same people. So I think it's wishful thinking on the part of Mel Morgan and and some of his supporters that George's support is eroding. And I especially know that when the voters of Idaho are allowed to see the truth, that they'll support George.
And in your view, the truth is that the congressman has been the victim of unfair and discriminatory prosecution.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm sure you've talked to a good many Republicans today, your friends and colleagues in the party. Are they, to a person, saying the same thing, feeling the same way you are tonight about this?
No, I haven't talked to a lot of my colleagues tonight.
So, but your guess would be, I assume, that not many of them are going to be swayed by what happened today.
No, especially those that have had the opportunity to see the other side of the story. I think those people that have seen it are more behind him than they ever were.
Okay, Mr. Barlow, let's go back to Mr. Morgan and let him have a comment or two on some of the things you've just said. I believe Mr. Barlow was suggesting that Congressman Hansen will be able to ride this one out just as he did the conviction before the primary.
Well, I wouldn't blame Rusty for saying that. You know, if I was a George Hansen supporter, I'd say that. I just don't happen to think it's true. There isn't any use in getting into an argument on television in that regard. Let's wait until November and see which one of us are right.
Mr. Barlow?
Great challenge.
Okay.
We accept it.
You talked about a poll. Do you have some polls now?
No, but
Tell
there
us
are
about
polls being taken right now by our people. I don't blame George for not taking a poll, but we'll be taking polls.
And you think they'll show clearly that he's in trouble?
Well, unless I miss the American people and the citizens of Idaho, I think he's in trouble. I think George would admit he's got more problems than he had before. I think he's got problems politically.
Mr. Barlow?
Well, you know, I think that definitely has problems when people are spoon-fed one side of the story continually, and they're not allowed to hear the other side. Definitely has problems. They're basing their decisions based on the information that they have available to them, and that does create a problem for him. However, I think George will be able to overcome those problems. I think he has a program that he's going to take into the living rooms of the 2nd Congressional District. And I've seen the program, and I've seen people that were ready to draw and quarter George come out, you know, behind him again, ardent supporters, when they see what has happened to him. For an example, the penalty for the supposed mistake that was made was simply a civil penalty, but yet the Justice Department comes along with a criminal prosecution. Why, that'll never hold up in an appeals court. All of these problems that have happened over the years, and Mel Morgan's been involved in them, have merely been little insignificant paper shuffling mistakes. Richard Stallings had a mistake in his report. Nobody made a big deal out of it like they have done with George Hansen, and I think it's going to have a backlash effect. I think people are starting to see that this is a bunch of nonsense. They can't beat George Hansen based on his record because he votes the way the people in the state of Idaho want him to vote. He represents them very well. He goes to the wall for them. If they have a problem, he's right there. People appreciate George, and I think that...
Well, let me, just on that point, excuse me for interrupting, but let me go back to Mr. Morgan just on that point, that George Hansen really does vote the way a lot of people in the 2nd District want him to vote, and he does, as he says, go to the wall for people.
He does, and that's his job. But I think if you look at his voting record, I don't think he votes that many times. In the last 14 years or 15 years, however the time has been, somebody has always been trying to get George, including me. And what you know, that's what you're talking about. I have been maligned a million times over this thing. I'm not going to do anything to help George Hansen get elected. You can rest assured of that. But George Hansen has got a political problem. The Republicans are going to have to face up to that problem. If they don't, they're naive.
We'll come back, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Now we move on to two journalists who have been covering this story and George Hansen for a long time. Rod Grammer is the political editor of the Idaho Statesman in Boise, and Randy Staples edits the editorial page of the Idaho State Journal newspaper in Pocatello. Randy, any significant new effect on voters as a result of what's happened here today?
I don't think it'll change too many votes in and of itself. I think most votes are probably, for the most part, made up. It may alter a few swing votes along the line. I don't think it'll have a major impact by itself.
Rod?
Well, Mark, I think one of George's problems before the primary was some of his longtime supporters were going away from him, and he worked hard just before the primary to get them back. And I think, if anything, this might cause some of those people to have second thoughts again, perhaps move away from George again. Because after all, now it's been a Republican Justice Department that prosecuted him, a jury convicted him, and now the Ethics Committee is made up of an even number of Republicans and Democrats. So, you know, just may cause more doubts.
So it is another, in your view, another ratchet up the line of difficulties for him. What's likely to happen now? I asked Richard Stallings. He certainly expects the appeal to not be decided certainly before the election. So this will be the campaign issue, will it not, in this race, Rod?
I think so, Mark. I think Rusty kind of echoed what George will be saying for the next 5 months, that the appeal, he'll win the appeal. Before the primary, he was saying that the Ethics Committee would side with him, and it's just, I think that's what George will be saying.
Randy?
Well, of course, he's been saying at each step along the line that he would be vindicated. He said that he would come out vindicated from the trial, and that's been the case all the way along. I don't think it'll change too much in and of itself, but this will definitely be the issue. It definitely heightens the voltage a little bit.
Let me ask you about I think you'll hear some disagreement here, and already have, between Mel Morgan and Rusty Barlow about the effects across the board on the Republican Party. Is there a big negative in this for the Republicans? Not George Hansen. Set aside George Hansen and his race for a minute, Randy.
I don't think there will be a lot of effect aside from that one race. You have to remember, first of all, that the top of the ticket will include Ronald Reagan, who is unquestionably going to get an enormous vote in the state. I think that will keep a lot of the Republican voters for a number of the races in the Republican side. I think the effects will mostly be felt in this one race.
Rod?
Well, I think it probably won't affect a lot of individual races, but it could affect the party in the long term, Mark. A lot of the party officials, especially Dennis Olson, have taken a lot of heat for siding up to George, and I think some of the Republicans are going to look around and say, well, look at the mess now Dennis Olson and people got us into now, and perhaps we could see some kind of change in direction of the party down the road.
Well, if I could add something, I agree with that. I think that there could be a change in some of the leadership of the party down the road if some of these people who have allied themselves so closely with Hansen along the line find out, after all the appeals have been exhausted, that Hansen has not been vindicated, and they're exposed in that way.
How would, finally, how would the two of you rate this race as we sit here tonight? Is it a toss-up at this point? Is Hansen still ahead despite all these troubles? How would you rate it, Rod?
Well, I think Hansen's races are always a toss-up, Mark. He's just an incredible politician, but Stallings has to be just on the upbeat right now, and George is definitely on the defensive, but I would still call it a toss-up.
Dead heat, absolute dead heat.
Okay, Mr. Barlow, let me go back to you on that point. How do you see this race today? Is it really going to be close, regardless of how it turns out in November?
I think it's going to be close, but I think he's going to beat his opponent by a larger margin than he did last time.
And that was about 7,000 votes, as I recall.
Right.
Okay.
Somewhere around there, 6,000 or 7,000.
And it'll work that way just on the basis of what you said earlier, that people will come around to Congressman Hansen's version of this story.
Yes, because it's a truth, and people recognize the truth.
How would you rate the race as we sit here tonight, Mr. Morgan?
Well, I rated the race before the sentencing came down. I've rated Richard Stallings over George from the very beginning. He's a credible candidate. You can't sit here and tell me George doesn't have more problems than he's ever had before in his life, because he has. Now, if he can overcome those, that's one thing. But I can assure you that if you're waiting for Richard Stallings to attack George Hansen, that's not going to be. And if you're waiting for Mel Morgan to attack George Hansen, that's not going to be. The Democrats are going to go try to get Democrats elected, and we're going to do it in a clean and orderly manner.
Well, let me go back to the two observers here. What kind of campaign do you think we'll see between now and November here, Rod? Will it? How are both of these candidates going to conduct themselves, do you think?
Well, I think it'll be along the same lines as we've seen so far. Stallings can't afford to go too far over and criticize George. At the same time, George has to be on the defensive. He's got to be telling the voters or trying to convince his longtime supporters that he's right and the government's wrong. And I think we'll see the same sort of campaigning that we saw before the primary.
Randy?
Well, I agree with that. I think, too, though, that it could get to be a very desperate and possibly dirty campaign as it goes along. I suspect that neither Stallings nor Hansen themselves will want to get too deeply involved in it, but I imagine that we'll see a lot of rumors, a lot of things coming along down the line by people on the periphery of the campaign.
Rumors like the ones that Stallings talked about earlier this week about himself is the rumor was that he was perhaps losing his job at Ricks College and was having an affair.
Right, that kind of thing. In fact, I expect that as the campaign gets closer and closer, as Republicans become increasingly fearful of losing the seat, Democrats realize that this is their one big chance, their best chance probably ever, to take that seat, that the intensity will just boil over.
Mr. Barlow, do you expect Democrats to be dirty with George Hansen?
I hope not. I can tell you one thing, the Republicans won't be dirty.
What about, do you have any comment about these rumors about Mr. Stallings this week?
No, I haven't even heard them.
Okay. Mr. Morgan?
I have no comment about those rumors. In my knowledge of Richard Stallings, he's a fine, moral man. And if he's a liberal Democrat, boy, I'll tell you, he's an enigma in Idaho because he's as conservative as any Republican I've seen. Well, with one exception, maybe Rusty.
Let me go back finally to Rod Grammer and Randy Staples here for just a moment. We didn't talk too much about the Ethics Committee. Mr. Stallings believes that they'll go easy, as he put it. What do you think the Congress will likely do with one of its own members on this subject, Rod?
Well, I don't think they'll do much, Mark. I think they'll make some noise about it, but I'm in agreement here. I don't think they'll do much. That's the club, and that's the way it's done back there.
I said that, according to the wire service reports today, the possible penalties could range from a reprimand, which is merely a reading of something in the House, to expulsion, which requires a 2/3 vote, and nobody believes will happen, I don't think. Randy, how do you see this working?
I would expect a reprimand more than anything else. I agree the Ethics Committee has not been a committee to come down very hard on other members of the House. It just has not been a very hardball committee.
Do you think, either of you, finally, that we will see, as a result of, again, another element of this story unfolding today, more and more national interest being focused on this story? Randy?
It's hard to say. I would have expected a little more national interest up until now than there has been, and there's been virtually none. So I suppose not.
Rod?
I'm really surprised, Mark, that there hasn't been, and I think it almost argues against George Hansen's argument that he's a big wheel back in Washington and everyone's out to get him. I mean, here the national press just isn't even interested in this issue. And
Mark?
Yes, sir. I just have about 5 seconds left, I'm afraid.
Well, I think the reason the national press isn't interested is I think they can see what a farce it is. The attorneys on the ethics...
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt, I'm afraid. We'll have to leave it there. Mr. Barlow and Pocatello, we appreciate your joining us tonight. Thank you, sir, very much. Randy Staples, Rod Grammer, and Mel Morgan, thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate it. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back here on Monday. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.